Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'd love to just kick this off right away. So I think we've already heard that our panelists have managed through change in their career. It's during the good times and the challenging times. But I'd love to start just with a bigger picture on what type of change management each of the panelists have had to go through in the last year. So, Linda, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Hot off the heels of that major transaction, how has the transition been? Can you share some of the things that are top of mind for you?
I would say we probably had to go through pretty chaotic, pretty tumultuous change management. A whole lot of things occurred as a result of Copperleaf being acquired. So we were acquired by a company that's head officed in London, IFS. And immediately on day one, both the CEO and the CFO were transitioned out of the organization. That resulted in sort of an automatic leadership change, and then a lot of cascading changes as a result of leadership change. And we talked earlier about, is leadership change a very key change in an organization? And it certainly is. Your culture, values, a lot of things permeate from that level. So that was a big change. I would say the second major change that occurred immediately following was a downsizing of the organization. And it was fairly significant in two ways. One is just in terms of numbers. It was a significant number of people based on duplicate roles, unneeded areas of business, and so on by the acquiring company. But it was also very, I want to use the word shocking in a sense, because Copperleaf had never gone through anything like that. There had never been any kind of downsizing or right sizing. So that was very impactful. And I guess the third thing I would say is that certain people were immediately put into new positions as a result of some of the reorganization that occurs. Some of those people were promoted. You sort of get a power shift that takes place where different people now are in leadership roles, other leaders are gone, and everybody's trying to get used to either working for a new individual or a smaller team. Sort of allocating work becomes very complicated. So the HR team did a lot of work at Copperleaf to try to help employees navigate what I would call a series of significant changes very quickly.
I think it would be a great time to go over to Marina, who has experienced firsthand the leadership change as she's joined Clio. And Clio's on an aggressive growth journey, from what I understand as well. So we'd love to hear from you. Obviously, you had first order of business. What were those things? And how are you managing, not just professionally, but personally through the change?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. It's still my first year at Clio, so it's been a year of many firsts and a lot of change, which has been incredible. But no less, even with positive change, there's a lot of adaptation that comes in. And so, my first order of business was really ramping to Clio as a company and my teams and stakeholders. And when I was at Simple prior to Clio, as you mentioned, I built the people team from the ground up, right? So it was like five of us when I started. The people team when I left was about 50, and the company scaled from 200 to about 1,300. And it just felt like this natural organic shift over time. Whereas when I joined Clio, the team was well formed, strong foundation in place, and that has so many positives. And you feel like you're joining a self-sustained, really, self-sustaining team where you're jumping in, and the first order of business is how do you build trust? How do you build relationships? And so that's where I focused first is, just bringing my team together for, 2-day onsite within my first 60 days at the company to really build those connections, to understand their worlds, to build trust. Did listening tours, one-on-ones with everyone on my team, as well as key stakeholders, and then groups of employees across the company as listening tours, really trying to get a sense of the culture and what was top of mind for them as a business, what was working, what wasn't. And I got really curious about the business overall, and just really took the time to understand our customers, our products, and really believe that helped for a faster ramp and faster trust building, frankly. And And the last piece I'd say is just really investing deeply in my first year of understanding the culture and making sure that as we're scaling the team, you mentioned, rapid growth. We were hiring about or hired about 400 people this past year. And the big thing on my mind was how do we scale the culture as we're growing at that pace? How do we not just keep it consistent, but make it even stronger as we grow? And so that's really been a key focus area for me. And part of that was starting with even a shared understanding in those listening tours of, do we all agree on what the culture is, how the values truly translate into practice? And so that was a big part of the first stretch. And then I'd say on top of my own integration into the company, Clio has been going through some massive milestones over the last year. I already mentioned the headcount, but launching 3 new products for us. We started really with one product, which was our central product, to then have been layering on product upon product, and that's changed how we operate as a team. It's not just changed the product experience, but really how the whole organization, how the whole company runs. And we went through a pretty big milestone with our Series F financing, quite historic for Canada as well as us, and new expectations, right? You're operating at a whole new level, and so that's also been some change that we've navigated over this first year.
Great. Thanks, Marina. Rebecca, you've been with SAP, which is obviously on the scale of the companies we have here today, huge compared to the rest of the companies. So, and you've been there for a number of years now. You must have seen all types of change there. I would love to hear from you. What types of change management are you focusing on right now? What's top of mind for you at the scale that you're at?
So yes, Tara, great point. I've been with SAP for 15 years across various HR functions. And, there was a quote that one of our business leaders reiterated, an old CEO, and at the time he'd said, the rate of change will never be this fast and it will never be this slow again. And that has resonated with me because change is hard and it's certainly top of mind. It's top of mind, I think, at any scale and any point. It's extremely relevant within the tech industry. From a business perspective, SAP has gone from, primarily an on-prem software delivery company to wanting to shift to a cloud company. And now has set our sights on, being a leading company within the business AI space. And with that comes this constant evolving change. Linda touched on it. We've had lots of acquisitions. With that, we've seen restructurings. There's been a lot of lessons learned as we've gone through those different changes. And now we're also starting to think hearing from our customers, I think we're in a similar place. We're starting to think differently about, how we look at our talent. How are we looking at resumes? How are we looking at skills? How are they transferable so that we can really focus on agile change? And that can be hard at a really big company to have agile change or to have change that's not just trying to be driven top down. I think it's really important to remember that change management is emotional, and you can lay out the absolute best change management plan in theory, but there's always going to be factors that you're going to come up against, timelines or resistance, or information is going to change as you go along. And so absolutely, we've seen lots of change. I still have that when I hear about change. I still have that initial kind of gut feeling of like, oh, what does this mean? What does this mean for me? What does this mean for my colleagues? And how are we going to do this? But I think it's a very pertinent topic right now for BC Tech to be talking about, because it's probably the number one thing from an HR leadership perspective that I'm thinking about.
Great. Can we stay with you, Rebecca, just and double click into that? I mean, I think it's such an important point. When people hear change, often they feel a sense of loss, even if they don't know what the change is yet. But for the audience sake, can we get a little more tactical, and do you mind double clicking into what your approach is as it relates to change management?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, Tara, when you say it's the resistance of loss. And I think it's the loss of control, it's the loss of stability, it's the loss of what you know. So, you know, I think there's multiple factors. I don't know if I can give any like aha here about good change management, but you know, it's listening, it's clear communication. You know, I've talked to you a lot about in the past when you and I have engaged about what does transparency look like within communication. Um, I think there's a lot of companies that feel like they have to keep kind of what's coming under this tight lid, or we don't have all the information, so we're going to share minimally right now. And if, through my evolution at SAP, I think that we have learned that being transparent and being upfront and having people really invest in the change, having discussions around what happens if you don't change. What does that look like if you don't do it? And then it's that how we tell stories and how we really get, you know, we can say from the top down, like this is the change and it's coming and this is how it is and this is the timeline. If you want success, I think it's measured and it's a long roadmap. And as much as the business can be patient to let the culture catch up, you know, the better, because there isn't a point in change these days where it's happening so rapidly where you can kind of stop and do a check-in and say, okay, is this working really well, or do we need to pivot? Do we need to adjust? And so you have to sometimes build the plane while flying it when it comes to change management. But I would say, you know, agile execution, transparency and communication, storytelling, and having that really clear vision. And you know, we're a data-driven company. I love the analytics, but I like to really say, you know, tell the story around that analytics so we can get the emotional investment as to what's in it for you. Why do you want to change? Why do you want to see this happen?
That's great. Marina, I'd love for you to build on that. And let's hear from you, you know, how tactically, how you approach change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you both focused on more of the emotional versus like some prescriptive process that gets you through. Frankly, I recently was having a conversation with one of my leaders about a lot of the change that we're going through, both within Clio, societally, and she shared a quote that has always guided her in life, which was, "What if that fear was excitement?" Like when she's feeling afraid, she had it was someone in her family said to her, "What if that fear is excitement?" So how do you shift it to, you know, as Rebecca was saying, what happens if we don't do this? But what's the possibility? Like, what is the unlock for us if we do this thing? Recognizing whatever the changes, it may take time, but it's opening up possibilities. And so how do we channel a bit of excitement in there? But no doubt, change is emotional, no matter how we slice it, and no matter how much we try to spin some of the excitement into it. Um, so actually, I try to simplify models in general so that I can use them in different environments. And I tend to, my go-to is actually the three focus areas I described in your first question, actually, which is I focus on trust and relationships. I align on what are the problems and opportunities to be solved. And then I really lean on the culture to make hard decisions, if that makes sense. I can say more about each. I mean, in terms of starting with the relationships, I tend to look at, you know, where is there high trust already? Where is there maybe fractured trust or repair that's going to be needed as a result of these changes? So, you know, said differently, who are my supporters, who are my detractors, and how do we make sure that we're leveraging both and thinking through that? Um, I also think that, you know, so much of how you build trust in times of change is really about communication, as Rebecca said, and you know, whether it's early, open, honest, candid, and there's a model that again, it's a simple model, but I lean on it all the time around communication and change management and trust, and it's called the trust triangle, and it was, you know, Frances Frey put this model together. She's a Harvard Business School professor, and why it resonates is again the simplicity, but at each point on that triangle, there are different factors that affect trust. And the first is, are you in those times of change communicating authentically? Are you communicating with empathy? Is what you're communicating logical? And why I love it is it's an individualized model as well. So if I'm managing a change, I'm thinking about proactively what are the ways that I'm going to stay true in each of those aspects of that trust triangle. And her thesis is just that when something goes wrong, when trust is broken in change, it's usually that you wobbled on one of those three. So I try to get ahead of that and just make sure, is what I'm saying logical? Am I thinking about the impact on other people? Am I communicating authentically through that change? So another simple model I like to use. And I also really like to make sure that folks are aligned up front, not just on what is the goal, what's the desired outcome, but more importantly, what are the trade-offs we're prepared to make? Because I think that when we oversimplify the goal, we just want to accomplish X, we're not having the real conversation about the trade-offs that we're likely going to have to make. And Rebecca said it right, like things change when you're going through change, like where you thought you'd end up and the path you thought you'd take, maybe there's a sharp left turn, and how are we going to make those hard decisions? So that's a key part. And then I mentioned the culture. I really think culture gets tested when you're going through change, and if you have a strong culture, it's definitely been something that I've leaned on in the past to make a hard call. Like, okay, we could take path X. Is that aligned to our values or not? So how do we want to operate as a result of it? And it really has served as a grounding force and sometimes even accelerant through hard changes and decisions that we're making as a team. And then I said I like simple models, but I also do like a really detailed work back plan. Like, frankly, because it helps you identify if you're really being clear on the stages of the change and how long it's going to take. It helps manage expectations that this isn't going to be overnight. It helps identify clear owners. So if we really need to get something done, who's going to be that decision maker, so we don't have 20 people trying to spin the plates and make a decision. And so that really becomes your blueprint and helps you identify some of those potential blockers through the change.
That's great. And I love how you threaded the needle. We're dealing with humans, like Rebecca said. There are emotions involved. Trust is so foundational in the relationship between the employer and the employee. Linda, I would love to hear from you. Can you jump in here and share with us some of your more tactical approaches to change management?
Theoretically and strategically, we know we need buy-in, we need consultation, we need to socialize a change, we need to basically defend and help people understand a change. But tactically, we always try to set up a group of change agents, what we call the change agent group. We deliberately select certain people in the organization to sit on that team, and we pre-socialize all changes that are impactful to employees with that team first. Now, that team, in terms of how we select them, would be what we call influencers in the organization. So these are people that are either in leadership roles across the organization globally. So we get all the diverse input and we get the impact on different jurisdictions because different changes affect people in different jurisdictions differently. So we select a core group. They may not be in a leadership role. They may just be a long-term employee that's a big culture contributor and an influencer with other employees. And then following that, we announce we have a change agent group and we ask if anybody else wants to join, somebody who's enthusiastic about reviewing changes with us. So as a first pass, we've got a group that we can go to and say, how do you think this will impact people? And as an HR team, we always think we understand that, or as leaders, we might understand that, but we don't always. And there are things that come up, that we haven't thought of. We can't accommodate or compromise every single change to accommodate this feedback, but generally it helps us understand priorities at least. And following that, we go ahead and we announce the change and we get feedback from employees. And most of the time we're well prepared because that change agent team helped us with that and helped us anticipate. Sometimes we get validated that, hey, these 3 priorities are the priorities. Maybe we should go back and try to negotiate a different compromise to the change. So that tactically seems to work quite well for us. The other thing is I think employees feel very much involved and consulted. So you get that broader buy-in that you're looking for, even if not everything is understood or accepted.
I love that it's using that change curve, getting those early adopters in, Linda, and having them leverage their relationships with people within the organizations to bring them along on the journey. I think that's a really great piece of advice for people to take with them. I'd love to, thread the needle on this a little bit more. Marina, let's start with you. But, thinking back over the course of your career, what would you consider one of the more successful change management scenarios that you worked through? And why did it work? What did you learn from it? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, maybe just because it was a big topic too in one of the original polls, I'll focus on a leadership change. And I always feel like some of the hardest changes, frankly, are those that impact people personally. And so the change that I'm thinking of was one from my time at Netflix, where I was working with a leader who was taking over a rather large and high impact part of the business, a really high impact engineering org. And this was on the heels of us exiting the former leader. So naturally, the business wanted to see change fast, but it was incredibly complex. This was a pretty large, but still, I'd say nascent engineering team. If like, it sounds odd to reconcile that, but we were investing really heavily and quickly, and yet they hadn't been together for a really long time. And the previous leader was really loved, but the new leader was being brought in to really level up performance and to move things a lot faster along for the company. And so naturally, there was a lot of actually what we call at Clio VUCA, which is an acronym, VUCA, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. There was a lot of that going on, and we had to convert that to really be, how do you think about the vision? How do you think about creating clarity, adaptability? And so we were trying to turn that on its head. And we had to make a lot of hard decisions, like parting ways with engineers who had been with the company for a long time, but who weren't quite meeting the expectation, and whose roles changed significantly. And so it meant a pretty hard reset, frankly, on expectations with the team. We had to change the way we worked, our operating model, the way we were accountable to stakeholders. So we had to be much more communicative, much more adaptable. And I think what really helped, to your question, Tara, around what made it a success is I think the leader that I worked with really understood the assignment. Like he started building trust and relationships early, both with his team across stakeholders. He identified, kind of like Linda said, who are the critical folks in the team who had influence, who were the strongest performers, the culture carriers. And he and I partnered incredibly closely. In fact, at one point, my boss joked, like, we should get, leader X a desk right next to you because he's literally here all the time, like glued at the hip. And that really mattered throughout that change. So, he really worked to make sure the team was aligned to the new operating model once he and I were aligned. He was personally accountable to it. He was extremely transparent with the team. Even those who we had to part ways with, just treated everyone with the utmost respect and dignity. And that made a huge difference to building that trust. Not easy to say goodbye to your colleagues. And we just had such consistent communication points and really looked at what are the core operating rhythms that we need to change with the team to make this effective. And as a way to build more rituals and new habits with the team, which is key to any change. And we acknowledged it would be hard, but then I think the biggest piece was, as we were trying to build some of those habits, we celebrated wins together as a team, because I think that you get a lot more from folks when they feel like they're seeing the progress as well. Knowing it's going to be long and transformative, all of those small incremental improvements were celebrated together, and that really helped to sustain the change and to really have that new leader be set up for success and the new team set up for success. So, kind of going high level there, but hopefully that helps to give you a sense of what some of those common patterns were.
I think that's a great example. I'll pass the baton over to Rebecca now, just to jump in and let us know what she's thinking of in terms of one of the most successful change management scenarios in her career.
Yeah, I would say so much change, Tara, and it's constant and it's ongoing. And I would probably say, over the last 2 years, like many of our big tech peers, we had undergone restructurings, and it was very painful. And it was kind of the hardest change you can make as a company. And we were, losing legacy talent that we'd had for 20 plus years sometimes. It was painful to see leaders to leave. And it had a big impact on the organization. And at the same time, I think like lots of our peers, we were kind of readjusting our hybrid work and what that looked like and what the in-office demands were. And, SAP still has this award-winning culture. We're a great place to work. We won #2 across Canada last year. And it was like, well, how do we keep this momentum going of being an award-winning culture while we are having to make these kind of tough changes to be the cloud AI company that we want to be. And so, we have there's that saying like culture eats change for breakfast. Like if your culture's not aligning to the change is never going to be successful. And so you have to really think about any changes. How are you bringing, and we've touched on this, how are you bringing the culture along with it? How do you have those early adopters? How do you have champions? How is the business partnering with HR to bring on change? And I think when you can have that roadmap, and when you can slowly roll out change, and when you can bring along new leadership credos, and when you can have people invest together, that's probably one of the key aspects is, are you helping us build the change? Are you a stakeholder in the change? What culture do you want to see? What do you want to build? Are you having workshops? Are you having, ongoing employee surveys and feedback loops? Are you having change champions and voices? Change isn't a one-time stop. It isn't like, okay, I'm an executive and I've let everybody know we've changed. Here we are. Like, it's something that you're going to have to, multiple times in multiple iterations, communicate with employees and hear back from employees. Is the messaging resonating? Okay, no, let's pivot. Again, we all have this roadmap of where we want to go, but we want employees to invest in the culture, and to be an award-winning culture, and to be a place that you want to be, and to feel still like we're a place that's going to show up for you, for our employees. And so what does that look like? And leaning heavily on our employee network groups as well, to be part of that change, and to understand again, the reasoning, the storytelling. Why are we doing this? Where are we going? And, how can we build it together?
That's so great. And I think, it really touches on that ownership piece, having them own the change and not have it feel like it's happening to them, right? So how to make sure that employees are a part of it. Linda, we're going to jump over to you. Thinking back over the course of your career, what was one of the most successful change management scenarios that you worked through? And really what made it a success, and what were your learnings through that?
I guess I would say that Copperleaf, as kind of the startup and then the mature company, deciding to do an IPO was a very, very big change for the organization. It ran very much as an agile sort of startup environment, not a lot of systems and processes, not regulated in the same way, obviously, publicly traded companies are regulated, and very, very open environment. Everything was transparent, every deal we signed, everything we did. And that was an environment that people were very, very much engaged in. So when we had to go to employees and say, we're actually doing a public offering, there are a whole bunch of things that are going to change. We wanted to make sure everybody understood why those things were going to change. As an example, the transparency that they so embraced was going to become very limited because of insider trading and tipping and so on. We were all operating under new rules. People felt quite upset about not knowing that we just signed a deal, or not knowing, say, halfway through the year, what does the bonus payout look like? How are we doing this year? And we had to be very careful about announcing things like that. So that was something that was a big change, but we socialized it really well. We talked to employees in employee forums. We had Q&A documents. And then we also added to the Q&A and to some of the discussion, more controversial questions that we knew they would ask, like, well, are all the executives going to cash stock options? Are they all going to quit? Are we going to have new leadership? So these were interesting things that we did, which is kind of just put it out there. If you're worried about that, let's talk about it. Is it a possibility? Well, yeah, maybe some will. They understand, they have the information, they have the data, so they want some assurances. And you can't give assurances, but you can at least have the discussion. So those were some of the things we did. I would say the other thing we did is we tried to explain, very proactively, that we would lose some control of the organization in terms of ownership. So we had some early investors. They were represented on the board, a small board, and then all of a sudden we had to expand our board. You need a chair of an audit committee, systems, processes, regulations, different mandates for the board. And we did explain that, once you're publicly traded, at any point in time, the shareholders can vote to sell you. And we did say that being acquired was definitely a risk that was coming, which of course turned out to be the case 3 years later. Not that we knew that, but we had to explain that a lot is going to change now, and a lot will change in terms of our destiny and how much control we have over it. So that was also, I think, a very big change, but a very well planned and executed change.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great example, especially when we talk about what both Rebecca and Marina mentioned earlier around transparency with people and making
Mhm.
sure that we're transparent. But in an IPO scenario, there are certain things you can't tell employees, right? And so,
Yeah.
how do you make sure that you have the foundation of trust ahead of any event like that so that people understand why, and they believe you? So of course things don't always go the way we want them to. This was a great opportunity to highlight examples of where change went well. But you know, hindsight is 2020, and sometimes we don't know that things are going to go sideways on us when it comes to change. I would love to hear from each of you just lessons learned along the way when things didn't go as planned. Are there different patterns or common pitfalls that the audience should hear or be aware of that can have a really negative impact on change management? Linda, I'd love to start with you again on this one while we have you, and then we can move over to Rebecca and Marina.
The ones we typically know about are just not getting the buy-in and not getting the collaboration. And that's an easy thing to say, but in reality, when you've got a very heavy workload and you've got major changes that have to occur for other things to occur, you tend to just get in the mode of understanding the change yourself. You can see way out on the horizon, and you feel sometimes like you should just explain it and everybody should understand it. And, as we know, that's not the case. And we've heard discussion about the emotional impact of change. And it is significant. And even changes that we think aren't significant are to different people. So I think slowing down is always key. The thing that doesn't work is rushing through the change, assuming everybody's going to understand the rationale for the change, not feeling like you have to explain the risks or the downside of the change. So I think transparency is key. And I think when we want to kind of gloss over the emotional impact and we want to rush through it, and we don't want to focus on what's negative about change, it inevitably comes back to bite us. So I think having the patience to strategically think about the change and then execute operationally in a very measured way, and leave that space for the emotions that are going to come, because they are going to come and they have to be accepted and understood.
And Linda, like slow down to speed up, right?
Yeah.
Time
Yeah.
constraints are often something we struggle with when it comes to change management. You know, Rebecca mentioned it's never going to be this slow or this fast again, right? It's just going to get faster and faster. Rebecca, what about you? You know, what are some of the common pitfalls or things that have a negative impact on change management from your experience?
I think we're all just gonna repeat the transparent, be authentic, tell the truth. People can see through. So when you give them this glossy kind of corporate messaging, people see through that and are going, well, how does this impact me? What does this actually mean? What does this actually look like? And transparency doesn't mean oversharing. And there are things that you can't share. And also it can be difficult at times to share information because you don't have all of the answers already. And you want to avoid confusion, but you also want to be honest about, what this looks like or where you're at. And so where you can be authentic or where you can be honest, you know, don't think that you can implement change quietly. But kind of beyond what we've already talked about, something that's top of mind as a go forward, and I don't know the answer necessarily, but change fatigue is a real thing. And I think that that's where we're starting to get to at a point, particularly within the tech industry, is this idea of change fatigue, and it is preventable, but how are we going to, make sure we're not overwhelming people with it, because it's going to be so constant, and it's going to now, it's not something that happens like, oh, we do this one shift and then it's over. it's going to be a constantly being, iterations of itself. And so how are we going to prepare our culture for change, and ready our people to be, change ready? And so we talked about skills a little bit, like what are your skills, to the point where are you identifying change champions that are good with change? Are you identifying those managers that have change management skills that can collaborate with other managers across the business and pair them? Do we have mentors in place to talk about it? That whole idea around kind of grit and resilience as key components to talent, I think is, as pertinent as ever before. It's those resilient employees are able to adapt to a changing environment. And I think we need to provide our employees with the skills and the skill set to do that. So change doesn't have to always be such a scary place. It can be exciting, because change can mean growth. It can mean opportunity. And how do we start to shift the narrative around, yes, these things do happen and it takes you out of your comfort place, and it's not comfortable to not know, what your day-to-day looks like, or I know this task, that task, and that's my everyday. There is so much opportunity with change, and I think it's how do we embrace that?
Opportunity is so important in the change, and if you can help people see that, you're just ahead of the game right away. Marina, what about you? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, similar things came to mind. So it's interesting, like we all are going to talk with the same sort of failure mode. So I won't repeat too much of what's been said, but I do love what Rebecca mentioned around change fatigue. And I actually think that part of the failure mode that I've seen is not mapping sufficiently what the desired end state is. And so we make all of these half steps and we make compromises when we really know, like, or maybe we've not even failed, like we've failed to think about truly what is that desired end state. So that's been a bit of a failure mode, is compromising too much and really not having that North Star of where we're heading. And then from there, like that failure to assess the impact is something that I've seen as that consistent failure mode. And it often leads actually to more work down the road. So it's almost a false economy, right? We think we're going to move fast. We think this is going to be simple. And then it creates so much work down the road, needing to manage other changes, other resistance, and bring people along who you've left behind. And so that's been huge. And then the last piece I'd say around communication, because that's often the failure mode as well, is people just are resisting the hardest conversations that they should have up front first. And that can happen for a few reasons, right? You're working with an optimistic leader. That same optimism is something you need for change, but sometimes it means the optimistic leader doesn't want to see the darker sides of the change or the harder sides of the change. And so really having the courage to partner with them and say the hard things that maybe no one else will as their partner, I think is a huge piece to remedying that situation. And as a tool, something that I love to do with leaders is really putting together like that detailed FAQ. What are the hardest questions we're going to get? And doing that early on in the change, not at the end, so that you're really preparing for it and maybe adapting the way that you're going to navigate the change to avoid the pitfalls and the hardest questions down the road. And so that's often been a way to help mitigate, but not thinking through the hardest questions is also a failure mode.
Okay, great. I'm conscious of time, and I see there are some questions coming through in the chat here. I want to go to a really timely question, and I'll open it up to the panelists for whoever would like to jump in first. The question is, can you please share strategies and tactics for change management in the current environment of DE&I backlash and geopolitical shifts? I think it's really timely. I think with people leaders on the call here, this is something we're all thinking about right now. I would love to hear if anybody on the panel has thoughts on how they're approaching this, or how your organizations are experiencing this right now.
Maybe I'll jump in real quick. I mean, we have a value at Clio. One of our core values is design for diversity. So it is baked into like how we think about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the way that I've approached it is to have the conversation head on with our CEO. Thankfully, he's incredibly committed to diversity, equity, inclusion as well. And so it's I think it's natural to maybe if you're worried about a divestment, to avoid the conversation a little bit, not want it to come up in conversation. With Jack, it's easy to lean into that with him, and we talk a lot about the headlines we're seeing. And like, thank goodness we are so invested. And I think it's important to just articulate that, and to talk about the importance for your culture, why you value it, how we're going to keep the investment going. And uh, too often, I think, and I've seen this in other companies, and I think unfortunately in a lot of startups where we get very influenced by what's happening in Meta, what's happening in Google, what's happening in a lot of big tech, and it doesn't always work for us. It shouldn't be just applied, and it can be tempting sometimes to say this is the trend, we should jump on. And so being really declarative and just having that frank conversation up front of why it's not going to be the case for us. Um, that's been my approach, at least.
I think that's a great call out, and you know, having that identity as a company before going through a change really helps guide you through the change, right? Rebecca, I see you coming off of mute here. I'd love to hear from you how you're thinking about this.
I'd just like to re-echo Marina's thoughts around, D and I and B. I think that it's kind of a sad state of affairs that we feel like we're walking backwards in some areas. I certainly don't feel like that from SAP's perspective. I feel like we have really strong global values. I feel like I've always felt personally aligned with our values, and those aren't changing. I have heard from employees, very recently that they're concerned. They're concerned what that means for Canada. What does that mean for us here? We're so influenced by our partners, and I think it's just more important than ever to be an ally. And also, I think that the messaging around diversity and inclusion and belonging has been really muddied to what we're trying to be scared out of isn't actually what's happening. Having a diverse company is to your benefit. We know that, hands down. There's a business case for it. If you don't have a diverse company with innovative thinkers that bring different lenses and different perspectives, good luck innovating. So there's just that kind of set business case for it already. And I think that being an ally, it just means continuing to talk about it, even when it feels like, oh, am I walking into a political trap now if we talk about it? Because I'm going to start to bring up, a political crosshair on this topic. I think it's a part of our embedded company's values. I hope it's a part of yours. If you want to innovate and change, particularly in tech, it should be. And we should all be just carrying on personally.
That's great. Thank you both for sharing. Linda, I'm conscious of time. If you want to weigh in on this, 30
Sure.
seconds quick, and then we'll jump to one final question before we wrap here.
I think one that we experienced that surprised us was when we were arranging for a film and a speaker on Truth and Reconciliation Day to honor Indigenous peoples and their history in Canada and in British Columbia specifically. We did not consult First Nations employees, and it seems like an obvious thing to do in retrospect. But as we do, we get our heads down. We're trying to get something done, so we arranged it, and we had some feedback that we kind of missed the mark on a couple of things, and that consultation would have really enhanced what we did. So we took that feedback. We made sure that we did not do anything like that again without consulting the people who are most emotionally impacted by something like that. So again, it's we're a very inclusive, progressive environment. We were doing this because we really wanted to honor First Nations history, and we made a couple of mistakes in doing so. So it can happen again if you're not as consultative with the right people as you should be.
All three of you for leaning into that question and being honest and vulnerable with us. Final question, and it's going to be rapid fire really quickly. There are some folks on the line right now that are joining us from startups who have big, ambitious goals. Is there a mantra or advice that you would give to them on how to manage change within their ever-changing environments and small teams? Just a quick anecdote or mantra would be great. I'll start with you, Marina.
Yeah, maybe I'd say like start as you intend to go on. You've got a gift that you're a small company. It can be daunting when you're a small team, but really it's so much easier to set a strong foundation for your culture, which then is like the key ingredient to change and managing change well. So focus on that early, because that's really what's going to take you through the scale, and your culture is going to be that guide for you. So start as you intend to go on would be my mantra.
Great. And Rebecca, what about you?
Start with those strong foundations. We just talked about values, communicate relentlessly, roadmap change gradually if it's possible, and it's not always possible, but it's okay to stop and reflect if you can. And I would say, celebrate small wins, because people feeling like you are making those small wins is very motivational. So
Okay, great. And Linda?
It's tough when you're in a startup environment, because everybody's role, including all the executives and all the employees, is usually broader than it might be later on if the company scales. So um, I think it's really important in startups to kind of remind everybody that organizations do go through maturity stages, and commonly you might have a founder and a group of very passionate people who act as we used to call our executive team, sort of superheroes, who had been there for 15 years building an organization from nothing to a billion-dollar organization. And they did that to a large extent without enough resources, and we never have enough resources as a startup. So as you start to move through those maturity stages, you have to remember that you will, inevitably need more systems, you will need more processes, and you will need successors, which is another really important aspect of startups, because as you grow, you will find that you can't sustain the kind of the five superheroes that get everything done. And I think that's something that there's some very, very good research on these maturity stages, on what happens organizationally in terms of changes you go through. And I think it's a good thing for startup organizations to talk about that, to say, this is amazing, that we've come to this point. But as we start to go through change, this is why this isn't sustainable. In other words, what got us here isn't going to take us to the next level. And you have to start to introduce those things that will help you elevate and scale to the next level. And it's hard to do that again, but those conversations, I think, are really, really important.
I just want to wrap by giving a huge thank you to BC Tech for holding space for conversations like this. It's so important that as a community we come together and we share our knowledge and grow and lift each other up. So huge thank you to BC Tech for having us all today.